All right, welcome to week 12. We are going to be talking about slavery in the Old South today. Of all the regions of the United States during the first half of the 19th century, the pre-Civil War Old South was the most distinctive. What had once been a narrow band of settlements along the Atlantic coast dramatically expanded westward and southward to form a subcontinental empire rooted in cotton. The southern states remained rural and agricultural long after the rest of the nation had embraced cities, immigrants, and factories. Yet the Old South was also instrumental in the nation's capitalist development and its growing economic stature. After the War of 1812, for example, southern-grown cotton became the key raw material driving industrial growth and feeding the textile mills of towns like Lowell, Massachusetts, where wage workers toiling over newly invented machines fashioned it into thread, yarn, and clothing. The price of raw cotton doubled in the first year after the war, and the profits made by cotton producers flowed into the hands of Northern and British bankers, merchants, and textile mill owners, many of whom made loans to Southerners to buy more land and more slaves. Northerners also provided the cotton industry with insurance, financing, and shipping. The story of how Southern cotton clothed the world, spurred the expansion of global capitalism, and transformed history was woven with the threads of tragedy, however. The revolution spawned by the mass production of cotton accelerated the spread of slavery across the South into Texas. A group of slaves in Virginia recognized the essential role they played when they asked, quote, "Didn't we clear the land and raise the crops of corn, of tobacco, rice, of sugar, of everything? And then didn't the large cities in the North grow up on the cotton and the sugars and the rice that we made?" Frederick Douglass was an extremely effective spokesman for abolitionism. After escaping from Maryland, he made his way to Massachusetts, where he began speaking at anti-slavery meetings in black churches. He recounted his painful encounters: the whip, the chain, the gag, the thumbscrew, the bloodhound, the stocks, and all the other bloody paraphernalia of the slave system, he said. Through his writings and dazzling presentations, Douglass became the best-known man of color in America. "I appear before the immense assembly this evening as a thief and a robber," he told a Massachusetts group in 1847. "I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and ran off with them." After publishing his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, in 1845, Douglass, fearing that his prominence would make him accessible to fugitive slave catchers, left for an extended tour of the British Isles. He returned 2 years later with enough money to buy his freedom. He then started an abolitionist newspaper for blacks, the North Star, in Rochester, New York. He named the newspaper after the star that runaway slaves used to guide them toward freedom. Throughout his career, Douglass insisted that slavery could only be overthrown by continuous resistance. Douglass was also active in other reform movements, including the Campaign for Women's Rights. Douglass advised Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. He spoke specifically on the importance of enlisting black soldiers in the Union Army. We're going to read about that later in the semester. Douglass died in 1895 as a new system of white supremacy based on segregation and disenfranchisement was being fastened upon the South. The reason why I've spoken so much today about Douglass is because not only did he accomplish great things in a time when American society largely worked to battle African American education and success, but also because his life and works span the rest of the semester. Douglass seemed like a good jumping-off point to begin these last weeks, in which we will discuss many of the things that affected Douglass's life, including slavery, sectionalism, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. So let's begin with discussing slavery in the Old South. When Frederick Douglass was born in 1818, slavery was already an old institution in America. Indeed, what made the South most distinctive was not its climate or soil, but its system of race-based slavery. The majority of whites did not own slaves, but they supported what John C. Calhoun called the South's peculiar institution, because it was so central to their way of life. Calhoun's carefully crafted phrase allowed Southerners to avoid using the charged word slavery, while the adjective peculiar implied that slavery was unique to the South, as it essentially was. During the first half of the 19th century, cotton surpassed rice as the most profitable crop in the South, and its revenues spread far beyond the region. By the 1850s, New York City, where much of the cotton was bought, sold, and shipped abroad, garnered 40% of the revenue. Southern cotton, called white gold, drove much of the national economy. Cotton shaped the lives of the enslaved who cultivated it, the planters who grew rich by it, the mill girls who sewed it, the merchants who sold it, the people who wore it, and the politicians who warred over it. "Cotton is king," exclaimed the Southern cultivator in 1859, and wields an astonishing influence over the world's commerce. In 1832, more than 80 of America's largest companies were New England textile mills. Because of its warm climate and plentiful rainfall, the Lower South became the global leader in cotton production. But as soils were exhausted in older southern states like Virginia and the Carolinas, and that happened during the first half of the 19th century, the Cotton Belt moved south and west. Farmers moved to western Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and eventually Texas. Relocation and profits required the breaking up of slave families and back-breaking labor. The death rate was lower on this second Middle Passage, that is, an interior part of the slave trade within the United States due to the cotton boom. So the death rate was lower on the second Middle Passage than it was on the passage across the Atlantic, but it was still higher than the death rate at that time. The slaves were not fed enough, they were not given clean water, nor were they allowed to rest enough on their long journey. Once they arrived in this new land, they had to farm a new crop, cotton. The formula for growing which was simple: cheap land, cottonseed, and slaves driven to exhaustion by profit-seeking planters who viewed them as property. By 1860, the center of the Cotton Kingdom stretched from eastern North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, through the fertile Alabama-Mississippi Black Belt, so called for the color of its soil, through Louisiana onto Texas, and up the Mississippi Valley as far as southern Illinois. In the Cotton Kingdom, the only city of significant size was New Orleans. With a population of 168,000 people in 1860, New Orleans ranked as the nation's sixth largest city. Unlike most other cities with slavery, New Orleans also attracted large numbers of European immigrants. In 1860, 40% of the population was foreign-born. And New Orleans' rich French heritage and close connections with the Caribbean produced a local culture quite different than that of the rest of the United States, reflected in the city's distinctive music, dance, religion, and cuisine. So New Orleans is a place that has a lot of agriculture, but is also very urban. That makes it very unique in the American South. And that is the end of part 1. We're going to talk about class and slavery in the South in our next part of our lecture video.